I am now very privileged to welcome Rosa Godshall from the Seminole Wars Foundation, also an author, and I love this, a fixer of typewriters and many other Renaissance wonderful things. Rosa Godshall, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
All right, hi everybody. It's good to be back. I was coming regularly and then I started running all over the globe, so I'm home now. So today I'll be talking about Indigenous history in Florida. This is a huge topic which I've managed to condense into under 20 minutes, so you'll definitely want to read more into this later on. So for those who don't know me, I served the village of North Palm Beach as their official historian from 2010 to 2014. And my book, Village of North Palm Beach, A History, was published in 2020 by the History Press. And I touch on some of the things I talk about in this presentation are also in that book, because you can't write about Florida history without talking about Indigenous history. I'm also the president of the Seminole Wars Foundation, and at the end I'll talk a little bit more about what we do. Next slide, please. So this is a really handy map that shows where the indigenous tribes resided throughout the state. So you can see the Ais lived in our area before the arrival of the Spanish. And I think it's also important to note that these different names kind of came from the Spanish interpretation of them. Like, for example, the Ais, that was kind of what the Spanish heard when they came here, and it referred to, I believe, the chief of the tribe. So we don't really know what they called themselves because we don't know their language. So, all right, we'll refer back to this map a couple more times. So you can go to the next slide. So this is a photo that I took of a historical marker at Gleason Park, which some of you may have seen already. In 1605, it was written that the 17th century town of Pentoya, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was located near the confluence of the Ugali and Indian rivers. So the town was located between Gleason Park and the Banana River Lagoon to the west, and consisted of shell middens, mounds, and a causeway. Like many other mounds, they were destroyed when the materials were used for roadbeds in the early 20th century. And next, we'll talk about the Hiaga, which is to the south of here. Next slide, please. So this is an artist's rendition of the Hiaga natives, and I always wonder when I look at pictures like this whether they really look like that. I don't know. So there are ceremonial mounds, and there are also midden mounds, and the midden mounds are refuse piles of shell and pottery, though there are a few left due to development. For example, a Hiaga mound once existed in Riviera Beach in Palm Beach County that was really quite large, and it was discovered by Charles Newcomb in 1901, but it has long since been demolished. So the Historical Society of West Palm Beach has a drawing of that mound that Newcomb made in 1914, showing that it extended 5 blocks from what's now West Park Drive to the shore of Lake Worth. There is another Hiaga mound. Oh, just to note, I believe I say this in my book, that mound might have been a major town, so that's really interesting to think about. There's another Hiaga mound that does exist, and that's beneath the Du Bois Pioneer Home, also in Palm Beach County, that was built on top of the mound in 1898. You can visit that house, they do tours, and the mound. Very little is known about the Hiaga beyond evidence recovered from these mounds, such as flint. Since flint isn't naturally found in South Florida, it indicates that the Hiaga traded with northern tribes. Farther south is where the Tequesta lived. And we'll go to the next slide. So this is what's known as the Miami Circle, which was a phenomenal discovery in the area that the Tequesta lived. And this was threatened by development. I remember reading about groups trying to save the structure, and I also know a few people who worked on the site. I believe a compromise was made and things were built around it, so it's now a National Historic Landmark. And I'll read this excerpt from the Trail of Florida's Indian Heritage website. Quote, excavation revealed 24 holes forming a perfect circle in the limestone. In January 1999, the discovery of the Miami Circle was announced. Archaeologist Robert S. Carr said the Miami Circle may be of national significance as it is believed to be the only cut-in-rock prehistoric structural footprint ever found in eastern North America. So that's huge. An independent assessment of the site's origin and significance was conducted in May of 1999. One of the people on that team was archaeologist Brent Wiseman of the University of South Florida, who is also a past president of the Seminole Wars Foundation. The team concluded that the site probably represents the footprint of an important structure built by the Tequesta or their ancestors. So we have a lot of fascinating sites of Indigenous history here, and I'll touch on a few more. Next slide, please. So in 1575, the first memoir to describe early Florida was written by Hernando Fontaneda. Fontaneda wrote that he'd been captured as a boy by the Calusa, and we saw on the map that the Calusa lived on the west coast of Florida. But he was rescued at age 30 by Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who is mostly remembered for founding St. Augustine. Fontaneda spent 17 years in captivity and provided the first documentation of the Calusa villages, including Tampa. He also mentioned the Hiaga and Ais tribes, who lived on the East Coast, but he never interacted with them. It was Jonathan Dickinson who met the Hiaga near Jupiter Inlet in what's now Palm Beach County, more than 100 years after Fontaneda's memoir was written. So again, I think it's important to consider that the impression we have of these ancient cultures are largely influenced by early accounts. Archaeology is our best tool for learning more, but it's really interesting to think about these accounts in terms of settler memory, because these people came here from other lands and had their own ideas and presumptions about native cultures, which shaped their accounts. Next slide, please. So Florida is home to many important archaeological sites, and they each tell the stories of tribes that were wiped out after the arrival of the Spanish. There's a lot we still don't know that archaeologists continue to research. And another site is the Windover site, which is near here. The next time someone tells you Florida doesn't have any history, you can let them know that the Windover archaeological site is older than the Egyptian pyramids. It is considered one of the most important sites ever excavated. And there's a similar site with bundle burials that was discovered underwater in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. So the Minnesota Key offshore is an archaeological site in the Gulf of Mexico near the southwest coast of Florida, 21 feet below the water's surface. The site was discovered in 2016, and the burials are very similar to those found at Windover. The site has been below sea level for close to 7,000 years, but it is well preserved. The remains were buried in a freshwater pond 7,200 years ago, and the pond was about 9 feet above sea level at the time. I remember reading that Florida used to be 50 miles wider than it is, so that's really interesting to envision. And this is from the Florida Division of Historical Resources. The examination of the site revealed multiple burials and clusters. The burials were in what had been a layer of peat at the bottom of a freshwater pond. Wooden stakes were found associated with the burials. The peat had helped preserve the bones and the wooden stakes. 2 of the stakes found at the site yielded radiocarbon dates of 7,200 years ago, early in the Archaic period in Florida. Next slide, please. So since this is a lot to take in, I put the map up again. So you can see the areas we've already discussed here. And now we'll move on to Tamaqua to the north. Next slide. The Tamaqua lived in northeast and north central Florida and southeast Georgia. They had about 35 chiefdoms with thousands of people. The various groups spoke several dialects. When Europeans arrived, they occupied about 19,200 square miles with a population of about 200,000. So this is a reconstruction of a Tamako house that's based on archaeological evidence, and the houses were circular and made of thatch. Next slide. The Miccosukee tribe is shown on that map that we saw in the Panhandle, and historically this group moved between present-day Georgia and northern Florida. They hunted, fished, and traded from the Appalachian Mountains to the Florida Keys. According to the article Florida Seminole and Miccosukee from the Handbook of North American Indians, multiple groups joined together to form the core that became the Miccosukee tribe in northern Florida. As more Europeans arrived, many Miccosukee ancestors found themselves in northern Florida by the early 18th century. And this is a photo of 3 Miccosukee sisters in Everglades City, which is a really cool town to visit if you've never been there. And that was taken between 1933 and 1960. Next slide. The Appalachians lived in the Florida Panhandle until the 18th century and spoke a language which no longer exists. They lived on the site of the Velda Mound, which is pictured here, beginning around the year 1450 CE, and they began encountering the Spanish around 1528. According to what I've read, by 1704, they'd largely fled to the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama. In the 1950s, Velda Mound was looted, which damaged it and altered the structure. However, it has been repaired, and it is owned by the state and managed as Velda Mound Park in Tallahassee. Next slide, please. Again, the map. So, like the Miccosukee, the Choctaw are still around. Most were forced to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, which largely began in Florida, which is something a lot of people don't know. The Indian Removal Act went into effect in 1830. The Choctaw lived in several states, including Florida. The Creek and the Seminole were also forced onto the Trail of Tears. According to the National Park Service, an estimated 3,500 Creeks died in Alabama and on their westward journey. Some were transported in chains. Next slide. We can take questions afterwards if you have a question. So I mentioned the Indian Removal Act was put into place in 1830. The Seminole Wars had already started in Florida. They lasted from 1817 to 1858, 42 years, and were the longest and costliest Indian wars ever fought by the U.S. government. They started because the government wanted to retrieve slaves that had run away to Florida and joined the Seminole tribe. This took place over a long period of time. The Black Seminole resistance, in particular, was a huge threat to the institution of slavery. General Thomas Jessup said in 1836, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war, and if it be not speedily put down, the South will feel the effects of it on their slave population before the end of the next season." So there is no doubting what this was about. So this painting here is called Incident at Thomas Creek, and it was done by my friend and fellow member of the Seminole Wars Foundation, also another past president, Jackson Walker. He's a really phenomenal artist, and he has a website if you want to look at more of his work. During the Trail of Tears, next slide. During the Trail of Tears, some Seminoles were transported to Oklahoma and still live there to this day, but many others resisted removal and are thus known as the unconquered people. To bring all this into the present day, some scholars have dismissed the idea that the ancient peoples of Florida are the ancestors of the Seminole, which I personally feel is short-sighted and unfair. The Seminoles see the ancient tribes as their ancestors. In the book Selling Vero Beach, which I brought with me if you'd like to look at it afterwards, the author writes that Floridians too often view modern Seminoles as migrants rather than indigenous to the region. Quote, "Scholars have ignored the connections that the modern Seminole have to the indigenous polities of pre-colonial and colonial Florida. The Seminole, for example, moved throughout South Florida in the 18th century into Ais, Hiega, and Tequesta territory on their way to trade with Cuba, and traded deerskins, honey, beeswax, dried fish, and various fruits to fishers who offered guns, metal goods, rum, cloth, coffee, and other items." It is a common mistake to assume that no descendants of the original Florida Indians have survived. Finally, we have some Seminole leaders here. We're most familiar with Osceola, who's pictured on the right, but there were other notable Seminoles who had just as much, if not more, of an impact in their day. So on the left, you see John Horse, who is the leader of the Black Seminoles. And in the middle is Wildcat, or Coacachee, who was also a leader during the Second Seminole War. And I would encourage you to research more about them, because they're really interesting. Next slide. So to learn more about the art and culture of the Seminoles in particular, I highly recommend checking out the Atatiki Museum, which is a few hours south in Clewiston. It's a long drive, but it's well worth it. My good friend Elgin Jumper, in the middle there, is a Seminole artist and poet, and he's held many events in the past there, and the museum has a number of his paintings. In fact, you quoted Betty Mae Jumper in the beginning, and she's his aunt. So he's a poet as well, and as a young boy, he was very inspired by her. So in this photo, we were at the University of Florida in Gainesville, where he unveiled his Seminole Starry Night painting, which was inspired by Van Gogh. And it's behind him, and I know it's hard to see, but it shows kind of him as a boy painting the Starry Night in the middle of a black and white painting. So that's pretty cool. Yeah. So I think it's really important to remember that Indigenous history isn't just in the past, it's very much in the present. And last slide. So thank you for listening. As I mentioned earlier, I am the president of the Seminole Wars Foundation, and the group was founded in 1992. And we are dedicated to the preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history in Florida. We work with the Seminole tribe, we help to preserve historical sites, and we publish scholarly materials on the Seminole Wars. And you can check out our website. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. And we operate entirely on donations. So there is a link on our website if you're interested in donating. And that's me and our vice president, Debbie, at a reenactment. And I do bring my typewriters to the reenactments. And I teach kids how to use them, and then I give the parents a flyer and tell them about what we do. So if anyone has any questions or corrections, you're welcome to share.